Sarah Martinez sat quietly in the back corner of the packed courtroom, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The wooden bench felt cold against her back as she watched the proceedings unfold before her. She had been dreading this moment for months, ever since the incident that changed everything. The case wasn't even about her. She was here as a witness in a military contractor dispute, something that should have been routine and straightforward. Her former colleague, David Richardson, was suing their previous employer for wrongful termination. Sarah had worked alongside David for 3 years at Phoenix Defense Solutions, a company that provided logistics support for overseas military operations. David had always been difficult to work with. He was the type of person who spoke loudly in meetings, interrupted others, and seemed to believe that volume could substitute for competence. Sarah, on the other hand, preferred to work quietly and efficiently. She completed her assignments without fanfare and avoided office politics whenever possible. The trouble started 6 months earlier when their team was assigned to coordinate supply deliveries to a remote military outpost. It was a complex operation that required precise timing and careful attention to detail. Sarah had noticed several errors in David's logistics plans that could have resulted in serious delays, or worse. When she quietly pointed out these issues to their supervisor, David had accused her of trying to undermine him. From that day forward, David made Sarah's work life miserable. He would contradict her in meetings, question her decisions publicly, and make snide comments about her qualifications. Sarah endured it all in silence, hoping that their supervisor would eventually see through David's behavior. Unfortunately, when budget cuts came, Sarah was the one who lost her job, while David somehow managed to keep his position. Now, sitting in this courtroom, Sarah felt a familiar knot in her stomach. She had been called to testify about the working environment at Phoenix Defense Solutions and the circumstances surrounding the project that led to David's eventual termination. The irony wasn't lost on her that David had been fired just 2 weeks after she was let go, apparently for the same errors she had tried to warn everyone about. The morning had dragged on with testimony from various witnesses. Sarah watched as former colleagues took the stand, some supporting David's claims of unfair treatment, others painting a picture of an employee who was difficult and unreliable. She recognized most of the faces, people she had worked with day after day, sharing coffee breaks and discussing weekend plans. When the lunch break was called, Sarah remained in her seat while others filed out of the courtroom. She wasn't hungry, and the thought of running into David or any of his supporters in the hallway made her feel sick. Instead, she pulled out her phone and scrolled through messages from her sister, who had been checking on her throughout the day. "How's it going?" her sister had texted. "Still waiting to testify," Sarah replied. "Nervous. You'll do great. Just tell the truth." Sarah wished it were that simple. The truth was complicated, messy, and involved admitting that she had been too afraid to speak up when it mattered most. She had let David intimidate her, and now she was paying the price for her silence. When court resumed after lunch, Sarah's anxiety increased with each passing witness. She knew her turn was coming soon, and she rehearsed her answers silently, trying to prepare for the inevitable cross-examination. David's lawyer, a sharp-dressed man with cold eyes, had been particularly aggressive with previous witnesses. Finally, her name was called. The court calls Sarah Martinez to the stand. Sarah's legs felt unsteady as she walked to the front of the courtroom. Every eye in the room seemed to be watching her, judging her before she even spoke. She placed her hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. The words felt heavy in her mouth. The plaintiff's attorney, representing David, approached her first. His questions started innocently enough, asking about her background and her role at Phoenix Defense Solutions. Sarah answered clearly and honestly, describing her responsibilities and her professional relationship with David. "Miss Martinez," the attorney continued, his voice taking on a sharper edge, "you've testified that you and Mr. Richardson worked together for 3 years. During that time, did you ever have any conflicts with him?" Sarah hesitated. This was the moment she had been dreading. "There were some professional disagreements," she said carefully. "Professional disagreements?" the attorney repeated, raising an eyebrow. "Is that what you call it when you went behind his back to undermine his work?" "That's not what happened," Sarah replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "No? Then please tell the court exactly what did happen." Sarah took a deep breath. She explained about the logistics errors she had discovered, how she had tried to address them professionally, and how David had reacted poorly to her feedback. She described the hostile work environment that followed, and her eventual termination. The attorney listened with a skeptical expression, occasionally jotting down notes. When she finished, he shook his head slowly, as if disappointed by her testimony. "Miss Martinez, isn't it true that you were jealous of Mr. Richardson's position and his success at the company?" "No, that's not true." "Isn't it true that you fabricated these so-called errors in an attempt to damage his reputation?" "Absolutely not." "And isn't it true that when your scheme failed, you were rightfully terminated for your unprofessional behavior?" Sarah felt her face flush with anger and embarrassment. "That's not what happened at all." The attorney moved closer to the witness stand, his voice rising. "Miss Martinez, the truth is that you were a disgruntled employee who couldn't handle working with someone more qualified than yourself. You were intimidated by Mr. Centerty Richardson's expertise and experience, weren't you?" "I was not intimidated," Sarah said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Really?" "Because from where I'm standing, it seems like you were too much of a coward to address your concerns directly with Mr. Richardson. Instead, you chose to go behind his back like a coward." The word hung in the air like a physical blow. Sarah felt every person in the courtroom staring at her, waiting for her response. Her heart pounded so loudly she was sure everyone could hear it. The attorney's accusation cut deep because there was a grain of truth to it. She had been afraid to confront David directly. She had taken what she thought was the proper channel, but maybe that made her a coward after all. "I followed proper procedures," she managed to say. "Proper procedures?" the attorney scoffed. "You mean cowardly procedures. You were too afraid to stand up to Mr. Richardson face to face, so you skulked around behind his back instead." Sarah's mouth went dry. She looked around the courtroom, seeing the faces of people she used to work with, people who were now hearing her called a coward in front of everyone. She felt small and defeated, exactly the way David had always made her feel. The attorney pressed on, sensing her vulnerability. "Admit it, Miss Martinez. You were intimidated by Mr. Richardson because you knew he was better at the job than you were. You were a coward then, and you're being a coward now by not admitting the truth." Sarah stared at the attorney, her vision blurring slightly from the tears she was fighting back. The courtroom was completely silent, except for the sound of her own breathing. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. How could she defend herself against an accusation that felt so personal, so devastating? The judge looked at her expectantly. "Miss Martinez, do you have a response to counsel's question?" Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, trying to gather her strength. When she opened them again, she saw David sitting at the plaintiff's table, a satisfied smirk on his face. It was the same expression he had worn every time he had humiliated her at work, the same look of superiority that had made her feel worthless. In that moment, something inside Sarah began to change. The fear and shame that had dominated her thoughts for months started to transform into something else entirely. She thought about all the times she had remained silent, all the opportunities she had missed to stand up for herself and others. She thought about the real reason she had been so careful, so thorough in her work. The truth was, Sarah Martinez had never been a coward. She had been trained to be careful, to double-check everything, to never make assumptions. These weren't the habits of someone who was afraid. They were the habits of someone who understood the consequences of mistakes. But before she could find her voice to respond, the attorney was already moving on to his next line of questioning, apparently satisfied that he had made his point. Sarah sat in the witness chair, the word coward echoing in her mind, knowing that soon she would have to speak again. Little did anyone in that courtroom know that Sarah Martinez was about to reveal something that would change everything they thought they knew about her, something that would make the attorney's accusation not just wrong, but almost laughably absurd. The afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows of the courtroom, casting long shadows across the floor, as Sarah prepared to answer the next question. She could feel the weight of everyone's expectations, the assumption that she would continue to be the quiet, submissive person they all thought they knew. But Sarah had spent too many years hiding who she really was, and she was finally ready to stop running from her past. The silence in the courtroom stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Sarah could feel the weight of every stare, every judgment, every assumption that had been made about her character. The attorney was shuffling through his papers, preparing his next attack, while David sat smugly at the plaintiff's table, clearly enjoying her humiliation. But something was happening inside Sarah that hadn't occurred in years. The careful walls she had built around her past were beginning to crumble. Not from external pressure, but from an internal decision she was finally ready to make. The word coward continued to echo in her mind, but now it seemed almost absurd. The defense attorney, representing Phoenix Defense Solutions, stood up for his cross-examination. Unlike David's lawyer, this man had a gentler demeanor, though Sarah knew that didn't necessarily mean he would be any easier on her. "Miss Martinez," he began quietly, "I'd like to ask you about your background before you joined Phoenix Defense Solutions. You mentioned in your resume that you had prior experience with logistics and operations. Can you tell us more about that?" Sarah hesitated. This was dangerous territory. She had deliberately kept her previous experience vague on her resume, listing only general skills and qualifications. Most employers never pressed for details, satisfied with her obvious competence and strong references. "I worked in logistics coordination for several years," she said carefully. "Where specifically did you work, Miss Martinez?" Sarah's throat felt dry. She looked around the courtroom again, seeing the faces of people who had worked with her for 3 years but knew almost nothing about her past. She had been so careful to keep her two worlds separate, to be just another civilian employee doing a job. "Various locations," she replied, hoping he would move on to another topic. But the defense attorney wasn't going to let it go that easily. "Miss Martinez, I'm going to ask you to be more specific. Your professional references speak very highly of your abilities, particularly your attention to detail and your ability to work under pressure. One reference specifically mentioned your experience with high-stress operational environments. What did they mean by that?" Sarah felt her carefully constructed facade beginning to slip. She had asked her references to be discreet, but apparently one of them had said more than she had hoped. "I'm not sure what you're referring to," she said, though they both knew she was being evasive. The attorney walked over to his table and picked up a folder. "Your Honor, I'd like to present Defense Exhibit C, which is a more detailed background check on Miss Martinez that was conducted as part of our investigation into this case." Sarah's heart began to race. She hadn't expected anyone to dig deeper into her background. Most civilian companies were satisfied with basic employment verification and reference checks. The attorney opened the folder and pulled out several documents. "Miss Martinez, according to these records, you spent 12 years in the United States Air Force before joining Phoenix Defense Solutions. Is that correct?" A collective murmur went through the courtroom. Sarah could see David's confident expression beginning to change to one of confusion and concern. She had never mentioned her military service to anyone at Phoenix Defense Solutions. As far as they knew, she was just another civilian contractor with relevant experience. "Yes," Sarah said quietly. "And during your time in the Air Force, what was your specialty?" Sarah closed her eyes for a moment. The careful anonymity she had maintained for 3 years was about to disappear completely. "I was a combat systems officer," she said. The murmur in the courtroom grew louder. Combat systems officers were highly trained Air Force personnel responsible for operating weapons and navigation systems on military aircraft. It was a position that required exceptional skill, judgment, and the ability to perform under extreme pressure. "Can you be more specific about your duties, Miss Martinez?" "I operated radar, navigation, and weapons systems on board various aircraft." "What types of aircraft?" Sarah knew there was no point in being evasive anymore. The documents in the attorney's hand probably contained her entire service record, primarily B-52 Stratofortresses and F-15E Strike Eagles. The courtroom was now completely silent except for the sound of papers shuffling as reporters frantically took notes. Even the judge was leaning forward with interest. B-52 seconds and F-15ES were serious military hardware, and operating their systems required extensive training and security clearance. "Miss Martinez, during your 12 years of service, did you ever see combat?" This was the question Sarah had been dreading. Her military service hadn't just been training exercises and peacetime operations. She had deployed multiple times to active combat zones, flying missions that most people would never even hear about. "Yes," she said simply. "How many combat missions did you fly?" "I don't have an exact count." "Approximately?" Sarah knew the exact number. She remembered every single mission, every target, every moment of fear and adrenaline and responsibility. Approximately 230 combat missions over 4 deployments. The courtroom erupted in whispers and gasps. Even the stenographer looked up from her machine in surprise. 230 combat missions was an extraordinary number, representing years of active combat duty in some of the most dangerous airspace in the world. David's attorney was now looking decidedly uncomfortable. His entire strategy had been built around portraying Sarah as a weak, intimidated employee who was too cowardly to confront workplace conflicts. The woman sitting before them had voluntarily put her life on the line for her country over 200 times. The defense attorney continued his questioning. "Miss Martinez, were you decorated for your service?" Sarah nodded reluctantly. "I received several commendations. Can you tell us about them?" "I'd prefer not to go into detail." "Your Honor, may I approach the witness?" The judge nodded, and the attorney walked over to Sarah with one of the documents from his folder. "Miss Martinez, I'm showing you a copy of your military service record. Can you tell the court what medals and commendations you received?" Sarah looked down at the paper, seeing her own career summarized in military bureaucratic language. She had hoped never to have to discuss these things in a civilian courtroom. "I received the Distinguished Flying Cross, the Air Medal with multiple oak leaf clusters, the Combat Readiness Medal, and several others." The Distinguished Flying Cross was one of the military's highest honors, awarded only for extraordinary achievement during aerial flight. The Air Medal was given for meritorious achievement during aerial operations, and multiple oak leaf clusters meant she had earned it many times over. "Miss Martinez, can you tell the court what you had to do to earn the Distinguished Flying Cross?" Sarah was silent for a long moment. This was exactly what she had been trying to avoid. Her military service belonged to a different life, a different version of herself that she had carefully tucked away when she returned to civilian life. "I participated in a mission that required flying through heavily defended airspace to deliver precision strikes against high-value targets." It was the most sanitized description she could give of what had actually been a harrowing 12-hour mission deep into enemy territory. Flying at night through surface-to-air missile fire and fighter aircraft, helping to coordinate a complex strike package that had taken months to plan. Was this a solo mission? No. I was part of a crew. What was your role in the crew? I was the mission commander. Another wave of surprised murmurs went through the courtroom. Mission commander meant that Sarah had been responsible not just for her own aircraft systems, but for coordinating the entire strike package, making split-second decisions that could affect multiple aircraft and crews. David was now staring at Sarah with a mixture of shock and disbelief. The quiet woman he had intimidated and bullied for months had been a decorated combat veteran with more leadership experience than he would ever have. The defense attorney returned to his table and picked up another document. "Miss Martinez, I'm looking at your performance evaluations from your time in the Air Force. Your supervisors consistently rated you as exceptional in categories like decision-making under pressure, attention to detail, and leadership capabilities. Is that accurate?" "I suppose so. One evaluation specifically states that you consistently demonstrated exceptional judgment in high-stress combat environments and showed remarkable ability to identify and correct potential problems before they became critical issues." Does that sound familiar? Sarah recognized the language from her performance reviews. Yes. So, when you identified errors in Mr. Richardson's logistics plans at Phoenix Defense Solutions, this wasn't the first time you had caught potentially dangerous mistakes before they caused problems? No, it wasn't. The attorney was building his case methodically, painting a picture of Sarah as someone whose attention to detail and ability to spot problems wasn't a character flaw or an attempt to undermine colleagues, but rather a professional skill honed through years of life and death situations. "Miss Martinez, during your military service, when you identified potential problems or errors, what was the proper procedure?" "To report them immediately through the chain of command. And did you ever hesitate to report problems because you were afraid of confronting your colleagues? No. In combat situations, hesitation can get people killed. So, when you reported your concerns about Mr. Richardson's logistics plans to your supervisor at Phoenix Defense Solutions, you were following the same procedures you had used successfully for 12 years in the military? Oh, yes. David's attorney was frantically whispering with his client, clearly trying to figure out how to salvage a case that had just taken a dramatic turn. The woman he had called a coward had spent over a decade in one of the most demanding and dangerous jobs in the military. But the defense attorney wasn't finished. Miss Martinez, I noticed that you never mentioned your military service to your colleagues at Phoenix Defense Solutions. Why was that? Sarah had been dreading this question because the answer was deeply personal. I preferred to keep my military and civilian lives separate, but surely your experience would have been relevant to your job. Why hide such an impressive background? Sarah was quiet for a long moment, struggling with how much to reveal. Some people have preconceived notions about military veterans. I wanted to be judged on my civilian work performance, not on assumptions about my background. It was a diplomatic way of saying that she had encountered discrimination before, people who either assumed veterans were unstable or who felt intimidated by their experience. She had learned that sometimes it was easier to blend in as just another civilian employee. Miss Martinez, when Mr. Farr Richardson accused you of being intimidated by his expertise, were you actually intimidated? No. Why not? Sarah looked directly at David for the first time since taking the stand. Because I had commanded missions involving dozens of aircraft and hundreds of personnel. Coordinating supply deliveries to a single outpost wasn't particularly challenging compared to what I had done before. The simplicity of her statement made it even more powerful. While David had been struggling with basic logistics that Sarah could have managed in her sleep, he had convinced himself and others that she was the incompetent one. The defense attorney smiled slightly. Miss Martinez, you mentioned that you preferred to avoid office politics and confrontation at Phoenix Defense Solutions. Was this because you were afraid of conflict? No. It was because the stakes were so much lower than what I was used to. Workplace disagreements seemed trivial compared to life and death decisions I had made in combat. Sarah's testimony was systematically dismantling every assumption that had been made about her character and competence. The quiet woman who had endured months of workplace bullying was revealing herself to be someone with extraordinary experience and qualifications. But the most significant revelation was still to come. The defense attorney was clearly building towards something significant. Sarah could see it in his posture, the way he was carefully laying the foundation for what was coming next. She had a sinking feeling that her attempts to keep her past private were about to be completely shattered. Miss Martinez, the attorney continued, during your military service, did you have a call sign? Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Call signs were deeply personal identifiers used in military aviation, often based on personality traits, memorable incidents, or exceptional performance. They were how aircrew members were known to their colleagues, sometimes more familiar than their actual names. Yes, she said quietly. What was your call sign? Sarah closed her eyes. This was the part of her past she had most wanted to keep buried. Her call sign wasn't just a nickname. It represented a reputation she had earned through years of exceptional service, and it connected her to a world that most civilians couldn't understand. I'd prefer not to say. The judge intervened. Miss Martinez, please answer the question. Sarah looked around the courtroom one more time. David was staring at her with a mixture of confusion and growing concern. His attorney looked like he wanted to object but didn't have grounds to do so. The reporters were leaning forward, sensing that something important was about to be revealed. My call sign was Hawk, she said. The defense attorney smiled. And how does a combat systems officer earn the call sign Hawk? Sarah was silent for a moment, remembering the mission that had earned her that name. It had been early in her second deployment, during a complex nighttime operation that had gone wrong in multiple ways. When their primary target had been obscured by weather and enemy activity, Sarah had spotted a secondary target that intelligence had missed. A convoy of enemy vehicles that posed an immediate threat to friendly ground forces. Hawks are known for their exceptional vision and their ability to spot threats from a distance. she said simply. Is that why you were given that call sign? I developed a reputation for identifying threats and problems that others missed. The attorney walked back to his table and picked up another document. Miss Martinez, I'm looking at a mission report from your third deployment. It describes an incident where you identified a potential surface-to-air missile site that wasn't on the intelligence briefings. Your early warning allowed multiple aircraft to avoid what could have been a catastrophic ambush. Is this accurate? Yes. The report states that your exceptional situational awareness and attention to detail likely saved multiple aircraft and crews. Is this the type of incident that earned you the call sign Hawk? It was one of several incidents. Sarah was remembering things she had tried to forget. The weight of responsibility. The split-second decisions. The knowledge that other people's lives depended on her ability to see what others couldn't see. Her attention to detail wasn't a quirk or a personality flaw. It was a skill that had been tested under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. The defense attorney was methodically building his case, but Sarah could see that David's attorney was preparing for redirect examination. She knew he would try to salvage his client's case somehow. But she also knew that her military record spoke for itself. Miss Martinez, the defense attorney continued, after 12 years of distinguished military service, why did you decide to leave the Air Force? This was another question Sarah had hoped to avoid. Her departure from the military hadn't been because of any problems or conflicts. If anything, she had been encouraged to stay and continue advancing through the ranks, but after multiple combat deployments and years of high-stress operations, she had made a personal decision that few people understood. I was ready for a quieter life, she said. You voluntarily left a successful military career to work as a civilian contractor? Yes. And you specifically chose not to mention your military background to your new colleagues? I wanted to start fresh. The defense attorney nodded understandingly. Miss Martinez, when you identified the errors in Mr. Richardson's logistics plans, were you drawing on your military experience? Partially. Logistics coordination was part of my military training. And when you reported these errors to your supervisor, rather than confronting Mr. Richardson directly, were you following military protocol? Yes. In the military, you report problems through the proper chain of command. Did it ever occur to you that Mr. Richardson might interpret this as an attempt to undermine him? Sarah considered the question carefully. In the military, if someone reports a legitimate problem, it's considered professional diligence. I assumed civilian workplaces operated the same way. It was becoming clear that Sarah's approach to workplace issues had been shaped by years of military training, where identifying problems was not only acceptable, but essential for mission success and personnel safety. The defense attorney was nearly finished with his examination. But he had one more important point to make. Miss Martinez, I want to return to the accusation that was made against you earlier. Mr. Richardson's attorney called you a coward for not confronting his client directly about the logistics errors. Based on your military service and combat experience, how do you respond to that characterization? Sarah had been waiting for this moment. The word coward had been echoing in her mind throughout the entire examination, becoming more absurd with each revelation about her background. I responded to a workplace problem the way I had been trained to respond to operational problems for 12 years, she said. In my experience, the chain of command exists for a reason, but specifically, how do you respond to being called a coward? Sarah looked directly at David, then at his attorney. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but clear, carrying the confidence of someone who had been tested in ways most people never would be. I flew over 200 combat missions in some of the most dangerous airspace in the world. I've made life and death decisions under enemy fire. I've commanded complex military operations where failure meant people died. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the courtroom. I'm not a coward. The simplicity and quiet dignity of her response was more powerful than any angry outburst could have been. She wasn't boasting or trying to intimidate anyone. She was simply stating facts that spoke for themselves. David's attorney stood up for his redirect examination, clearly scrambling to salvage his case. Miss Martinez, isn't it possible that your military background actually made you unsuited for civilian workplace dynamics? I don't think so. Isn't it true that military personnel are trained to follow orders without question, which might make you uncomfortable with civilian workplace discussions and negotiations? Sarah almost smiled at the question. Military officers are actually trained to think critically and adapt to changing situations. Following orders blindly would be dangerous in combat. But you admit that you avoided direct confrontation with Mr. Richardson? I reported a professional concern through proper channels. That's not avoiding confrontation. It's following established procedures. The attorney was clearly grasping at straws. Miss Martinez, don't you think your colleagues had a right to know about your military background? I don't see how my background was relevant to my job performance. But you were essentially operating under false pretenses, weren't you? The defense attorney objected before Sarah could answer. Your Honor, Miss Martinez was under no obligation to disclose her military service to her colleagues. Sustained, the judge ruled. David's attorney made a few more attempts to damage Sarah's credibility. But it was clear that his case had been fundamentally undermined. The woman he had portrayed as a weak, intimidated employee had just revealed herself to be one of the most qualified people in the courtroom. When both attorneys finished their examinations, the judge dismissed Sarah from the witness stand. As she walked back to her seat, the courtroom remained unusually quiet. Everyone seemed to be processing what they had just learned. David was staring at her with an expression she had never seen before. Not anger or smugness, but something approaching respect and perhaps embarrassment. For 3 years, he had bullied and intimidated someone who had commanded military operations he couldn't even imagine. Sarah sat down in the back of the courtroom, feeling emotionally drained but somehow lighter than she had in months. The secret she had guarded so carefully was finally out, and the world hadn't ended. If anything, she felt more like herself than she had since leaving the military. The trial continued for another day. But the outcome was no longer in doubt. Sarah's testimony had not only supported the defense's case, but had also revealed the fundamental absurdity of David's claims. A decorated combat veteran with an exceptional military record was not someone who could be easily intimidated or who would fabricate reports out of jealousy. When the jury returned their verdict, they found in favor of Phoenix Defense Solutions. David's wrongful termination lawsuit was dismissed. And Sarah felt a sense of vindication that went beyond just this specific case. After the trial, several of her former colleagues approached her in the hallway outside the courtroom. They seemed almost shy, uncertain how to relate to someone they now realized they had never really known. Sarah, one of them said, "Why didn't you ever tell us about your service?" Sarah thought about the question for a moment. "I wanted to be known for who I was as a civilian, not for what I had done in the military. But you were a decorated combat veteran. That's incredible." "It was my job," Sarah said simply. "Just like logistics, coordination was my job at Phoenix Defense." As she walked out of the courthouse that afternoon, Sarah felt a sense of closure she hadn't expected. For years, she had compartmentalized her life, keeping her military and civilian identities separate. But maybe it was time to stop hiding from her own accomplishments. The word coward no longer echoed in her mind. In its place was something she hadn't felt in a long time. Pride in who she was and what she had accomplished. Both in uniform and out of it, Sarah Martinez, call sign Hawk, was finally ready to stop being anyone other than herself. 3 weeks later, Sarah received a job offer from a defense contractor that had been following the trial. They weren't interested in hiring a quiet logistics coordinator who tried to stay invisible. They wanted to hire a decorated combat veteran with proven leadership skills and an exceptional attention to detail. When Sarah accepted the position, she made sure her military service was prominently featured on her resume. She was done hiding her past, done pretending to be someone she wasn't. The call sign Hawk represented everything she was proud of about her military service. Exceptional vision, attention to detail, and the courage to speak up when she saw potential problems. Those weren't qualities to be ashamed of or to hide. They were exactly the qualities the world needed more of. As Sarah started her new job, she made a promise to herself that she would never again allow someone to make her feel small for doing the right thing. She had spent too many years in service to her country to waste any more time being intimidated by people who mistook her professionalism for weakness. The woman who had once commanded combat missions over enemy territory was finally ready to command her own civilian life, with the same confidence and integrity she had shown in uniform. Call sign Hawk was back.